Okay, good morning. My name is Alice Broad-Jones, and I am the State Librarian for TXDAR. I'm a member of the Sam Houston Chapter DAR. I'm here this morning with Ann Smith, who is also in the Sam Houston Chapter, and with Nancy J. of the Austin Chapter in Austin, Texas, and we have the absolute pleasure this morning of interviewing Sergeant David A. Fleming, Jr. We are in Longview, Texas, and it is the first day of November 2018. Mr. Fleming was in the United States Air Force from February of 1943 until October 1945. His highest rank was a sergeant. Sergeant Fleming, thank you for being here with us today. Please tell us where and when you were born.
It's my pleasure. And I was born in Cleveland, Ohio on September 3rd, 1918.
And that makes you 100 years and 2 months
Exactly,
of age.
yes.
And
yes.
you're an amazing specimen for a centurion.
Thank you for that.
Thank you for being here with us. Tell us a little bit about your family, David. What was your father's name and occupation?
My father's name was David A. Fleming Sr., and he was in sales of industrial safes in the eastern half of the United States.
And you were born where?
I was born in Cleveland, Ohio.
And did you live there for most of your life?
No, we lived in Cleveland only my first 6 years, and then my father's work moved us to Cincinnati, Ohio, where we lived for 2 years. And then from there, we moved to Greensburg, Pennsylvania.
Now, what was your mother's name?
My mother's name was Harriet Selcraig.
And was she a native of Ohio?
No, my mother was a native of the little town of Northeast Pennsylvania, which is about 12 miles east of Erie and a mile from the shores of Lake Erie. And in Northeast Pennsylvania, I had grandparents, 4 aunts, 4 uncles, and 26 cousins.
So there was a large family contingency there.
Indeed it was, yes.
Very good. And tell us about the children in the family. Where were you in the birth order and how many siblings?
I was the firstborn, and I had a sister that was 6 years younger. Older. She was 6 years younger, and she passed away during a tonsillectomy, which we both had at the same time. And later I had another sister who is now living in Florence, South Carolina, and she is 11 years younger than I am. Mm-hmm. But we keep in touch.
Good. Mm-hmm. Was your father in the military?
He was not.
And do you know whether your grandfather or any other members of the family served in the military?
I had uncles in the military. In fact, my Uncle Bob, living in Brooklyn, New York, was in the cavalry. And I have his spurs as a memorabilia item. So that was, and then my Uncle Gene was in the military in the infantry. And so my father's brothers, of course. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What about your early childhood, your education? Where did you go to school? And tell us a little bit about your high school and if you went to college, etc.
Well, my father's work caused us to move frequently, and because of that, I went to 13 different schools from first grade until I graduated high school. And I went to 4 different high schools, one in Northeast Pennsylvania, one in Brooklyn, New York, Erasmus Hall. I remember that well because I was a junior and I commuted to it on the BMT subway. And it was during the Depression, and we were living with my grandfather and grandmother in Brooklyn, my grandfather being an Episcopal minister. And so those were regimented years for me. Mm-hmm. But I do remember that year of high school because that's where it was. Then after that I went to Ridgewood, New Jersey high school and graduated from that high school in 1938.
So from 1938 until 1943, what were you doing?
38 to 43. Well, after I graduated high school, I did take a couple of semesters at Colgate and at Columbia University in New York to supplement my work. I worked at first through a friendship that we had in Ridgewood, New Jersey. I worked in New York City as a clerk in an insurance company, and I commuted on the Erie Railroad to get to that job, Fulton and William Street in New York. And I have, this is an aside if I can,
Sure.
if I can do it. I have a great, an aunt that I loved very much in Brooklyn. She was a dean of economics at an all-girls high school in Manhattan, the Julia Richmond High School. And when I was 16 or 17, her all-girls high school would have their senior prom, and it was always at the Waldorf Astoria in New York, and she would always invite me, and she would introduce me to all of her girls. And so what a fond memory that is.
Oh, absolutely.
To be sure. So, and then after that I had an opportunity to work for Wright Aeronautical in Paterson, New Jersey, which I did, and I was in public relations there, and I was only there a year before being drafted into the Army, and that brings us up to that point.
So when you were drafted, tell us about that experience and then how you ended up in the Air Force.
Well, I wanted to be in the Air Force, and I specified that during the drafting process, and they were good enough to accommodate that desire on my part, and I'm so glad that I did end up in the Air Force, because my tour of duty overseas was more than a little interesting, because I was in the Air Force.
And the Air Force at that time was a relatively new organization.
Yes, it was, and things didn't always work exactly the way that they were supposed to. And my first assignment in England was in North England at a strategic air depot, and the mission there was to repair bomb damage of heavy bombers, B-24s and B-17s, as they came back from missions. And oftentimes they'd come back severely damaged by anti-aircraft fire, German anti-aircraft fire, and oftentimes they would have to belly land because they had no hydraulics that was shot out, and as they would land, when they were 500 or 600 feet off the ground, they would shoot off red flares from the cockpit of the B-24, signifying that there were dead and wounded on board. And it's a 10-man crew in heavy bombers, and so oftentimes there were 4 or 5 men who had been shot, either wounded or killed. And so we had emergency facilities to race down to the end of the runway until the B-24 stopped skidding on its belly. So those are exciting moments in time.
Let's go back a little bit to when you actually joined and talk about the boot camp and the training that you received, where you went.
My mother and dad at that point in time, it was during the Franklin D. Roosevelt administration in Washington, and my dad got a job as the safety director for the REA, which is the Rural Electrification Administration, and my mother became a receptionist in the Department of Public Health, and so they lived in Bethesda, Maryland, and so that's where I lived until induction. And it was interesting for my mother because she met congressmen and senators and their families as they would come in for health purposes, and so I remember that.
And where did you go for your early training, your boot camp?
my induction was actually at Jefferson Barracks, Missouri, which is St. Louis, and I went to I don't recall the name of the camp, but I do recall that it was in February, and there was 10 men in a tent and a potbelly stove for 0 temperatures at night, and we had a nickname for that camp. We called it Pneumonia Gulch. And so
Probably very realistically
it
named.
was. There was a lot of sick recruits.
Was it difficult for you to become accustomed to sleeping in a tent with 9 other people after being in a small family?
No, it was not, because there was a good camaraderie. Everyone was there under the same circumstances and for the same purpose, and there was a galvanization of men in the Army, because this was a war that we had to win, and there was no option otherwise. And
That's
so,
a real interesting statement. Did you understand, obviously you did, the significance of the United States entering World War II?
absolutely. I recall thinking many times that I'm a part of a worldwide event, and it has worldwide significance. And here I am through no effort or fault of my own, being a part of it, and I was thankful. It was an honor for me to serve my country.
So no hesitation on your part at
Oh
all?
no, not at all. No, not.
Did your family support your decision to join?
Absolutely. Well, I didn't join. I was
Or
drafted.
you were drafted?
Yeah, but sure, they supported me absolutely. And the patriotism was at a high level in our whole country, and so.
Well, the whole world had really been waiting for the United States to join
Sure.
the military effort, and I think that when we did, at that point,
Things started to change.
things changed.
Mm-hmm.
Now tell us about the food, because everyone talks about the horrible food in boot camp. So what was your experience?
Oh, quite the opposite. It was pretty good, and I know that the mess hall was about a mile and a half away from our tents, so we would be brought to a formation, and we'd have to march this mile and a half for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and back again, and with a drill sergeant barking out orders all the way. And I do remember that, and that was all part of the training, of the basic
Did you
training.
gain or lose weight?
I lost.
Did you?
I was skinny as a stick by the time I finished my boot camp.
So when you finished boot camp and graduated, where did you go?
I went to a college in Hattiesburg, Virginia, or Hattiesburg, Mississippi, to learn some of the basics of public relations. I worked for Wright Aeronautical in public relations, and so they thought that might be a fit for me once I got assigned overseas.
Mm-hmm.
So I had about 6 weeks of that training in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And I haven't done this before, so the continuity doesn't come quickly to my mind. So from there, it was pretty close to induction to shipping overseas time.
What
And
is your most memorable experience in Hattiesburg?
that experience was a bland experience.
Not much really
I wasn't
stands out.
enthusiastic about it to begin with, and it wasn't my idea to begin with,
No.
and so I viewed it in that light.
What did you want to do rather than PR?
I wanted to be involved with airplanes, and intimately involved with airplanes.
Mhm.
That's what I wanted to do. And so to that extent, my training in Hattiesburg, Mississippi was a bland experience.
So when you left Hattiesburg, where did you go?
I went to a camp on the Hudson River in just north of New York City for debarkation to England. And that that troop transport to England consisted of a 14-ship troop convoy. And these were converted cargo, or sometimes a combination of cargo and passenger ships. And the ship I was on had carried about 200 passengers and the rest cargo. And they had converted the hull of the ship to bunks, and the bunks were 5 bunk high, and I was assigned the 4th bunk from 12 midnight till 8 a.m. From 8 to 4 another soldier was assigned, and from 4 to 8 still another. So the same bunk accommodated 3 different soldiers, and so that was quite a unique experience.
Yeah, it was.
Also, the chow lines, there was only 2 servings a day, and it was about a 4-hour standing in line to get to where the chow was, wrapping around the ship's deck.
4 hours?
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
And the dinner entree was horse meat. I do remember that.
Ooh.
And prior to this convoy, and we couldn't go any faster than the slowest ship in the 14-ship convoy, so it took us 14 days to get to England, to Southampton, England. And prior troop convoys had been attacked by German submarines and torpedoed and sunk, so we had been assigned a Navy destroyer to accompany our convoy. So I thought that was pretty interesting too. But otherwise there was, well, we ran into some heavy seas and there was seasickness. And also there were 6,000 men on my ship that I was on.
What time of the year was it? Do you remember? Was it spring or?
Yes, it was spring. I think it was, well, I think it was maybe June. If I recall, it was June.
That would have been a pretty sporty ride about that time.
Yeah. Yeah, and there was seasickness and diarrhea at the same time.
Yeah.
And what had been a swimming pool had been converted to a latrine, and on the outer circumference of the latrine were toilets, and on the inner circumference were sinks. And sometimes when soldiers would come in there, both seasick and with diarrhea, they had to decide whether they should sit on the pot or go to the sink. And it was kind of an exciting place. And the medics were going around with Paragolic 2-gallon bottles for those who were seasick, and paper cups, and they were passing it out to whoever wanted it. And so that's kind of a
I
wild.
wonder if that was due to the horse meat diet.
Well, we tended to blame that on most anything, most everything. But it was an interesting crossing, I guess, to say the least.
Did you have a job to do on board the ship?
No.
So really you were just waiting to get to where you were going
Exactly.
and standing in line to eat all day?
Two chow lines a day.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Did you feel that you were under any threat at all, knowing that there may be a German contingency in the
Yeah, because it had already happened on previous troop transport crossings, and Germans were very adept at submarine torpedoes.
And did you have specific training as to what and where you would go
Just
in that
where
event?
life jackets were and where lifeboats were, and we had a couple of those drills, fire drills, on how to disembark if we had to. Yeah, we did have those trainings several times, in fact.
So you were going to Southampton, England.
Mm-hmm.
When you arrived, were you aware of what the future plans were going to be for that group, or were you just awaiting instructions?
I was just awaiting instructions. I didn't know in which direction I would go or how I would get there. And finally it was decided that I would be part of this 3rd Strategic Air Depot in Watton, England, which is a little bit north of the larger town of Norwich, about 120 miles north of London. And so they transported us there by train, and I took my assignments at this Strategic Air Depot. servicing B-24s and B-17 bombers.
Tell us a little bit about those aircraft. Those were enormous airplanes.
They were, and there were, as I've said, there were 10-man crew, and there was a heavy bomb load and 8 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, and also waist gunners, 50 caliber machine gun waist gunners, and this midway on the fuselage of the airplane there was a bubble on the top of the fuselage, which was a gun in position as well, a 50 caliber gun, and a nose gunner, and there was a tail gunner, and a bubble on the bottom of the fuselage, all with 50 caliber machine guns. And so it was a bristling, battle-ready aircraft in every respect. So, and as they went on these missions, they would get anti-aircraft fire from the Germans, and they would also be attacked from time to time by the Luftwaffe, which was German fighter planes, and finally our own fighter planes went to meet with them and shoot them down. And so, but all that battle damage coming back right off the missions made it kind of a chaotic situation sometimes at this base where I was.
What was your job on that base?
I was in charge of a certain amount of inventory of airplane parts and getting it delivered to the mechanics working on the aircraft when they needed it, and getting familiar with the specifications of the parts so that I could pull the right thing when they order them, and so that was my job.
Do you have a most memorable day while you were there? Describe just the most vivid memory that you have.
I think it was when a B-24 had suffered a lot of battle damage and had 2 engines out of 4 engines, and they were trying to get back with 2 engines, and out of their 10-man crew, 3 had been killed, and there was 4 badly wounded, and the hydraulic system on this B-24 had been shot out, so it couldn't lower its landing gear, and so it was firing red rockets out of the cockpit of the aircraft to let the people on the ground know there was dead and wounded on board, and they would need help as soon as they stopped skidding on their belly to the end of the runway. So that was a memorable event for me.
And that aircraft must have dropped like a rock if it was coming in like that.
It did. It was miraculous that the pilot and the co-pilot could control it enough to get it back from the mission, and certainly to get it landed. So, and that sort of thing happened fairly often where I was there. And sometimes I would wake up in the morning at this strategic air depot when it was before dawn, like 5 o'clock or 4 o'clock, 4:30, and I'd hear a dull roar, and I thought there must be a thunderstorm brewing. But it was not a thunderstorm. It was 1,000 heavy bomber airplanes headed for Germany.
So they were taking off.
They were taking, because these
goodness.
bomber bases were all around us, within a 100-mile radius of where we were, and they had all assembled together, coordinated their flight, and they were together, and there was 1,000 of them, and it was big news. Of course, they did a tremendous amount of damage. I remember that well.
So how long were you in that location?
Just about a year, and then we were getting close to D-Day. It had been planned for such a long time. General Dwight Eisenhower had been put in charge, the Supreme Commander, and I was sent to Birmingham, England, southern England, and at that time Hitler wanted to destroy London. So he was sending over these buzz bombs, which flew at very low altitudes to fly under the radar, and so they would fly across the English Channel And as they approached our location where I was, we were all sleeping in foxholes, and because the British Spitfire fighter aircraft were waiting for these buzz bombs above their altitude, and as they would clear the English Channel, they would dive on them and fire at them, and oftentimes disable them enough that they would start erratic flight, and oftentimes they would land in the field next to us, and the field would shake. It would shake like, literally like some unforeseen power was shaking the whole earth that you were living in part of. And so that was luckily that was a short term experience. And but I was there, I don't know, maybe for 4 months, 3 or 4 months.
Could you ever relax?
Not at all.
Never.
Because Hitler was sending these buzz bombs over at erratic times, day and night, and there was no schedule. Whenever he thought it was a good idea to send one, he'd send it, and they were 2,000-pound bombs, and so they were scary. And Hitler wanted to destroy London, and he did his best to it with these buzz bombs until British Spitfires were intercepting them and shooting them down or crippling them, and that was when it got scary for someone sleeping in a foxhole.
Were you aware of men near to you that were injured or fatally injured in that situation?
No, because once anyone was, they'd holler for the medics, and the medics would come with the stretchers and all their gear, and if they needed to evacuate them, they'd get an ambulance to them. And
So you didn't know their situation, you just knew they'd either been injured or
yes,
fatally injured.
Yeah, right.
Well, that was probably the best.
Yes, right. And then after that, D-Day occurred on June the 6th of 1944, and I was at this outfit that I was with in southern England. It was a P-47 fighter group, and we were to be sent over there, but not until they could be made ready for us. So, and German resistance to the invasion was stiff, and for the first 2 or 3 weeks, we couldn't even get off of Omaha Beach, our infantry, because we were being pinned down by German machine gun fire and everything that they had to throw at us. We finally got the town of St. Lo in flames, and that's where General George S. Patton formed his Third Army, which is world famous, and the Army Corps of Engineers bulldozed an airstrip for our outfit near St. Lo, the town of St. Lo, and clad it with steel plating so that our P-47 fighter planes could land. And we were then called from Birmingham, England. We had been on standby there, waiting for this call. And we were called, and our aircraft landed on that strip, and we lived in pup tents from then on, and our rations were K rations, and if it was a good situation, we would get C rations, which mean maybe we got some beef stew or something good like that. The K rations were just crackers and cheese and
Spam.
and spam and things like that. Yes. So, and then finally our infantry broke out of St. Lo, and we were under the command of George S. Patton and his Third Army. Our P-47 outfit was, and once we broke out of, our infantry broke out of St. Lo, General Patton and the Third Army and us almost raced across France. We had the German army on the run, and they were going fast, and we got so fast that our supply trains couldn't keep up with our mechanized units, our tanks and our mechanized military equipment, and we literally ran out of gas, and our advance had to be stopped.
And that was called?
And quickly, what was formed was a Red Ball Express, and that consisted of many 10-wheel Army trucks, which would load up with gas on Omaha Beach on the coast, and then haul it to the battle line in the field. And that operation went on 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, and making sure that General Patton was supplied all the fuel he needed. And we finally freed Paris, and there was tearful Parisians and Frenchmen, and much celebration, and I do remember that. And
when the Germans moved into France, it was really kind of an interesting situation because they had 3 separate areas. They had the occupied area, they had the center portion of that area where the administration of the military went on, and then they had the occupied force. So, and Paris was occupied.
Oh, to be sure. Oh, to be sure it was.
So the Parisians really, I mean, there was a line, literally a line of demarcation where they couldn't cross back and forth through the border. If they were in the occupied section, they couldn't go to the unoccupied section.
I didn't know that.
And I've read quite a bit about it, but I cannot imagine how happy those people were to see you.
You can't imagine is the right word. You couldn't imagine. They had been under German occupation, and their life was not their own. Their life routine was not their own, and everything was done on the German timetable, not theirs.
They were starving. Food
There
was
wasn't enough
hard
food
to come by for everyone, for
Right.
the Parisians and the French as well as the Germans.
Right.
So everyone was desperate.
Yes. Yeah. It was a desperate situation, and we were more than welcome by the French.
Now you spoke a little bit about Omaha Beach. Were you ever on Omaha Beach?
Yes, we were put down at Omaha Beach on the ship that we were on.
Describe that landing. That had to be something that was really extraordinary.
Well, the crossing, the English Channel is 80 miles long, and the crossing was in a mothership, and then these smaller troop ships were what we rode to the shore in, and they would go full tilt as far as concerned to get as close to the shore as they could before they hit bottom, and then the gate would drop down, and we would barrel out of there and get under the protection of the cliffs that were overshadowing Omaha Beach, and so that we were out of range of any fire. And then when it was more under our control, they transported us to St. Lo, or that area, which is where our new airstrip had been built, and we started to get that organized to receive our P-47 aircraft.
Do you have any recollection of how many were killed landing at Omaha Beach?
9,500 American soldiers were killed.
And they're buried there.
Yes.
Just a short distance.
Yes. Yes. That's what happened.
That had to have just been a bloodbath. I cannot imagine.
Even the waves lapping up on the shore were red with blood. It was a horrific situation, a chaotic situation, and it was something you'll never forget. And I've never tried to remember it until now. I've not had any experience reciting what I'm telling you now, so if I'm a clumsy speaker, you'll have to excuse me because I've had no practice.
So from there, where were you? You know, you were in France. You had protecting this border, or this military border. Was that the Battle of the Bulge? Was that called the Bulge?
June 6th was D-Day, of course, and then we went over there. My outfit went over there 18 days after D-Day, and we we were immediately assigned to General Patton and his Third Army, and this was just very close to St. Lo. And then the infantry broke loose, and we proceeded at a breakneck speed across France, and then took back Paris. And then about the middle of December, we found ourselves in a little town called Mormont-le-Grand, Belgium. And it was mid-December then, and the significant thing about that is that there were two significant things. One, the weather was terrible. It was snowing, low clouds, no visibility. Our aircraft could not fly. We were grounded for 2 weeks, and we were 9 kilometers, 16 miles from Bastogne, where our 101st Airborne Infantry Division had been surrounded by the German Army, and they were beating them up. They were killing and taking American prisoners and taking our equipment, and they were asked to surrender. They sent a white flag and a four-man group to ask General McAuliffe, who was the commanding general of the 101st Airborne Division, to ask him to surrender, because if not, that his division was going to be annihilated. And General McAuliffe had some other officers around him, and he said, "What should I tell him?" And the officer said, "Well, what do you feel?" And he said, "Nuts." And they told him that's what to tell him. So that became history. His reply to the German officers was nuts. And they didn't quite know how to interpret that. But they finally got the idea.
He was nuts.
We weren't moving. The 101st Airborne was not moving out of Bastogne.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, after 2 terribly hard weeks of bad weather, we had some good weather, and our P-47s were able to take off. And we went over to Bastogne, and we bombed and strafed and fired our rockets into the German troops, the German tanks, the German mechanized units, and we sent them scattering. And our 101st Airborne Division was freed up to rejoin the battle line. And so that was a great event. That was an important event.
Very historical event.
It was. And General Patton was a audacious, colorful commanding general. And a movie was made about him after the war was over, and it won 8 Academy Awards. Mm-hmm. He's a very interesting man. So I was proud to have served under his command. And the pride was justified by all of his accomplishments, of course. And so then from there we went on as we pushed the German army back into Germany. We went on to a town that had been abandoned named Hanford, Germany, which was near the North Sea in Germany, and it was an airstrip, and so our outfit landed there, and we had luxury at the moment because we had abandoned housing around the airstrip, and we got to live in a house.
No longer in a pup tent
No
or a
longer
foxhole.
in a pup tent, no, or a foxhole, and we had all kinds of good things to liberate from the house, German uniforms and things like that.
So when they left, they just left everything.
They were in a hurry. Yeah, they certainly were.
Yeah, I think Germany, of course, I mean, everyone examines the German analogy of the war, but they really had spread themselves too thin because they had Russia on one side and they had the Allies on the other.
Africa,
they were trying to defend themselves, and Africa,
and Italy.
They were trying to defend themselves against everyone at that point.
And Moscow and Russia, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the Russians were tough. Germans were tough, but I think the Russians were a little tougher.
They were.
They were more used to that frigid weather and the hard conditions. And
they were.
So.
They were, and then finally the war was over, and we started counting points. there was a general in Washington at the War Department named General Hershey, and he devised these gold bars that could be worn on your uniform. And for each gold bar represented 6 months of overseas service. And so I had 5 of them by that time. And
So you had served in 30 months of overseas.
yes. And we all called those gold bars for our uniform Hershey bars. And so we always kind of liked that we were collecting Hershey bars.
Where were you when you learned that Germany had surrendered?
In Hanford, in Germany.
Describe that day.
It was, I never saw such celebration and wild behavior. Everyone was beside themselves.
How were you told?
You know, I don't remember. I don't remember how I was told.
Do you remember if you had any expectation of that news coming, or was it a complete surprise?
Well, we had an expectation because the news was pretty telling about how it was going, and pretty soon the Germans had no more options. They had no place to turn, and we were in charge, not them. And as soon as that realization came into being, that's when they surrendered. And but I don't remember how I heard that news.
Do you remember where you were when you heard that Hitler had committed suicide?
No, I do not. I don't even know when that was, how long after the surrender. I don't remember that.
So that wasn't a big newsmaker at that point?
No, and it was more or less expected.
A byline, yeah.
It was kind of almost a ho-hum thing, you know. And there's a lot of other German officers who were going to be indicted and for war crimes.
Had you all been advised at all of the horrific, torturous situations that German had inflicted upon their prisoners and the Jewish people? Did you have any indication of that at all?
Yes, and I have some newspaper clippings here now. If you would like to have them or see them, I'll be glad to show them to you after this interview is over. And so you might like to see that. And I got some pictures of our fighter pilots, which you might also like to see, and I have them here to show you. So,
what were the troops' reactions to that?
To
just the horrific torture and the Holocaust and that sort of thing?
Well, it was. This is why we're here fighting this war.
So you knew it and you believed it?
Absolutely, sure, yeah. This can't be allowed in the world we live in, and that's how we felt.
Outrage.
Unacceptable.
Yeah, outrage.
Yeah, it has to be changed. So it galvanized us all the more. And there was, in this 406 fighter group that I was a part of, there was kind of a blurry line between officers and enlisted men. We were all in this together, you know, and we would do anything for each other, no matter what it was. So it gets a little emotional.
Well, it should. I mean, that was a very...
These men that I knew, the pilots, some of them didn't come back from missions. And we'd sent a 14-plane mission out, and I was part of operations. I would brief them on the missions, what the targets were, or I'd help do that. I didn't do it myself. And then, so we'd have 14 of our squadron take off for the mission. And then when they were coming back, we would all line the runway to count how many were coming back. We hoped 14, but all too often it was 12 or 11. And then, of course, the anxiety of who didn't come back. and what happened. And so of course we debriefed them in the operations room, and we found out who didn't come back and why and what the circumstances were and all those things. But those are dramatic, chaotic things. It's an emotional thing. I'll make no bones about it. Because I knew these guys, and they were close to me. So I have trouble with that.
Mm-hmm.
So
One of the things our military men and women enjoy today are certainly more flexible communications with their family. They are able to Skype and email and
I
by
have a
phone.
perfect example. I have a grandson who is a pilot in the Air Force, and he was deployed to Afghanistan I don't know how many times. He was in the Air Force for 20 years. He just got out 6 months ago. The way they did it, they would deploy him for 60 days, and then send him home for 60 days. Mm-hmm. And then they'd bring him back to Afghanistan for 60 days, and that's how they were doing it. And he finally got out, luckily unharmed, and he wasn't free to talk much about what he did with those missions that he flew. But he got out unharmed, and a girl was waiting for him, and had been for the last 3 years, and so they immediately got married. and as soon as he got out, United Airlines picked him up so fast that you could hardly blink your eye. So he's now a pilot for United Airlines, and he lives in Wichita, Kansas. So I'm proud of him.
And so you could communicate with him while he was gone?
Not while he was gone, but
by email or by...
when he was back. When he was back.
Now, how were communications with your family when you were in the military? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it was pretty limited, and at that time there was such a thing as V-mails, and they had some means of sending a short message, and I have some copies that I'll also show you when we've finished this interview, of a couple of my emails that I've sent home. Mm-hmm. So that was really the only communications we had.
And if there was an emergency in the family or death in the family, how did you learn of that?
That would get through to the group, and the men were told. And we had a public relations officer in the group, and he took care, and I helped him to some extent. And we took care of news releases about individuals and mm-hmm. for home newspaper consumption and things like that. So that kind of word would get to us. Was
the Red Cross active at that time?
They were, but I didn't see much of them. I saw more of them when, in the 3 or 4 months I was in Birmingham, England, and sleeping in foxholes and being bombarded by buzz bombs and people injured. Then the Red Cross was more prominent, and their ambulances were, mm-hmm. more visible. But otherwise, I didn't see them in England while I was in northern England. Mm-hmm.
In thinking of your military career in its entirety, what is your most vivid memory?
Well, I think it was the circumstance where we were in this little town of Morbihan-le-Grand in Belgium, and so frustrated because we knew that we were only 9 kilometers from Bastogne, and that our 101st Airborne Division was trapped. Mm-hmm. We couldn't fly because of the weather, and I remember going to a church on Christmas Eve Christmas Eve, and the longest, saddest faces on soldiers you've ever seen in your life were sitting in that makeshift chapel that our officer concocted for us, and to have a worship service. And I remember that very clearly, and I think that's my most vivid memory. And then when the weather broke and we could take off and go do what we do best over Bastogne, That's a great feeling. Wonderful feeling.
Those men were poised on the brink of amazing success or amazing defeat. And
Yeah,
to sit
and-
there because it was foggy
Yeah, and
had
snowing.
to be
And snowing.
horrible.
We had snow a lot of that time, and the German army had captured enough of our American soldiers and equipment, jeeps and things like that, and uniforms, that they were infiltrating our lines. They were coming back to our little town of Mormont-le-Grand, looking like Americans. They had American uniforms, driving American jeeps, and they spoke English, but they were Germans. They were from the German army, and they were there to kill us,
Sure.
or blow us up, or do something. And so we had 50 caliber machine guns mounted on all our jeeps and all our mechanized equipment, and everywhere, you know, because we were expecting to be hit by some of those infiltrators. So that was a memory that I almost forgot to mention, but it comes back to me now.
Now, when you found out the war was over, and at this point you're near the end of your military obligation, tell us about departing and coming back home.
Well, after a painful wait for that moment to happen, they put us on they put us on a train and and I guess they took us all the way back to Southampton in England, and we were put on ships, not a 14-ship convoy, but troop ships, and we didn't need the Navy destroyer escort, so we made pretty good time getting back, and so we got back to New York, and my mother, for some reason, I've forgotten now what the reason was, but she couldn't be there, so my dad was there to meet me.
So he was in New York to meet you.
He definitely was, yeah. And it's a little fuzzy for me now as to what happened after he met me, where we went and why we went wherever that was, and I just don't recall that.
I bet you were really glad to be back on American soil, weren't you?
You just can't imagine it. It's just an emotional, again, more emotion. I'm not an emotional person, but some of these things get to me, and so I must apologize for that.
No apology needed. So you were living in Bethesda, Maryland. Did you go back to Maryland at that point?
No, because I had just married about 6 weeks before I was inducted.
Oh, really?
Yes.
We forgot that
Yeah,
part.
we forgot all about that, yeah. And my first child was born in Bethesda, Maryland.
Oh.
Judy, my oldest daughter. And so I'd forgotten that. And so let's see what happened.
Now, what was your wife's name?
Janice. That's a good clue. I'm glad you asked me. Are we out of gas or something? So, no. So my wife's father had a little business of his own in Los Angeles. He custom made table pads for the department stores in Los Angeles. And he had me come in and help him and build those and deliver them to the department stores in Los Angeles. And one night in Pasadena, which is where we were, that's where my wife's mother and dad lived.
And this was after the war?
Yes.
Okay, so you're in LA at this point?
Yes, Pasadena.
California,
Yes.
right out of LA County.
Right. And I was sitting on the front steps of this little duplex that they lived in, and one of the neighbors walked past, and he came up and realized that I was recently released from the Army, and he sat and talked to me. Everyone did that, you know. They felt a kinship to us. So he said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm helping my father-in-law right now, but it's only a short term as far as I'm concerned. I don't know what he thinks about it, but as far as I'm concerned, it's short term. He said, well, I'll tell you, I'm the plant manager for the B.F. Goodrich Company in East Los Angeles, and I have a production plant there, and a lot of people under my guidance, and he said, we'll find a job for you down there. Come down and ask for me Tuesday or Wednesday of next week, and so I did that, and that's how I got started. And
Thus began your career.
it does. It was exactly that. Yeah.
Now, you and your wife had how many children?
We had 4 girls, and one of them passed away about a year ago, and she lived in Houston, in fact. And so, but my other 3 were very much at my birthday, my 100th birthday party in Austin in September this year, and so they're very much alive.
And you have numerous grandchildren.
16 grandchildren and 15 great-grandchildren.
Fabulous.
And they're all interesting people, every one of them. They're doing things like this grandson who was deployed to Afghanistan and is now a pilot for United, and I have a granddaughter in Austin who is a prominent realtor and a very successful one, and I have a niece who was there at Austin who lives in Michigan, and she spent her whole career in civil service in Washington, D.C. Her office was in the Ronald Reagan office building, and she worked for the FBI and Homeland Security.
So she's a busy lady these days.
Well, she retired. So now she's retired, and now her job is she's a dog walker.
That's a pretty good job if you like dogs.
That's what she does now. She's a dog walker. But she had that career, and so it makes her an interesting person.
Sergeant Fleming, if you had advice to give to a young man or woman considering the military today, what advice would you give?
Interesting question. As I maybe didn't say it, but I do go to a gym 2 days a week, and I've been doing it for 10 years. And I know everybody, not everybody, but I know a lot of people at the gym. They know me, and they put on a birthday party for me in September. 90 people were there, and the local, not the local, but ABC and CBS News was there, and I was on the local news program, and one of the people that was there who I met was so interesting to me. She was excited and enthusiastic because she had just been given her American citizenship. She is from she's from Cambodia. She's from Cambodia. She's 25 years old, and for some reason I guess looked up to me because I was the star of the show. Maybe that was it. But I kind of befriended her. I liked her. She had a good spirit, a good outlook. She had done a beautiful job in learning the language, our English language, and she was working in a little cafe that we have down there at our gym where I go, and I kind of tucked her under my wing, and she kind of asked me what should I be doing or what could I be doing, and she was working at this little cafe at the gym, and I said, so Cheetah, I had to learn her name. Her name is, she said, you know the tiger, Cheetah? I said, yes. And she said, well, just put a S-O-O in front of that, and that's my name, Suchita.
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 Mm-hmm.
So I said, Suchita, I was in the Air Force, and I'm proud of having been in the Air Force. And there's so many career opportunities and growth opportunities for you in the Air Force that I am going to suggest strongly and advocate that you aspire to joining the Air Force. And she practically said, you got it. and she's with recruiters now, and she's being interviewed, and she's determined she's going to be in the Air Force.
Wonderful.
So I love that experience.
What lessons learned did you bring with you into your civilian life from the military?
I think discipline is the key thing that I learned, and I think that discipline serves so many people so well in so many different ways that if you adhere to it, it will enhance your career, whatever career choice you've made. And I think it's important to dot every I and cross every T, and understand what the job description is, and do the job as the description says it should be done. And I think those are important things that I learned in the military. And I think if anything's worth doing, it's worth doing right. And it carries over, anticipating your being here with me this morning. I thought it was important to have a fresh pot of coffee made.
Well, thank you for that.
and to have all my World War II memorabilia here under our elbow, which I have, and which I will be showing you shortly. And so I think those are things I learned from the military. You know, I wrote your names down before you arrived here to make sure I would know your names. And I do things like that. That's just, I'm picky. I'm a picky person. I have a Mercedes Benz, and I'm picky about everything. That included, especially that included. So that all stems from my experience in the military, my training. Did that answer the question?
It did. And is there anything else you'd like to tell us about your military history? Is there a global statement or something that you remember now you forgot to discuss, or a memory?
No, there really isn't. I think we've covered it well, and as I say, I've not rehearsed doing this, so I'm not very expert at public speaking or doing what we're doing, but I feel like I've covered the ground as well as I can, and it really tells my story.
Thank you so much for being with us today, and more importantly, thank you for your service to our country and a time where we needed every man and every woman and their dedication and their loyalty to the United States of America. Thank you for being here.
It was my honor to have served.